Hi, I'm Emily. At my mother's 60th birthday party, in a rented banquet room with 40 people watching, my younger sister picked up the envelope I handed our mom, weighed it in her hand like it was nothing, and said out loud in front of everyone that it looked like a poor person's gift. Then she laughed. Not a mean laugh exactly, more the kind that expects everyone else to laugh along with her, and most of the room did because that's what people do when they're not sure what else to do. I stood there in my one nice dress, the one I'd worn to 3 different family events already because I couldn't justify buying another, and I smiled the way you smile when you're trying not to let your face crack in half. That envelope had cost me 8 months of Saturday shifts, a cancelled dental cleaning I still haven't rescheduled, and a lot of nights doing math at my kitchen table with a calculator I've had since community college. It wasn't wrapped in anything fancy, it was just a plain white envelope with my mother's name written on the front in my own handwriting, and inside it was a document that meant her house could never be taken from her, over a debt she didn't even know was still hanging over her head. My sister's gift that same night came with a bow the size of a beach ball and a poster board with balloons taped to it. Mine came with silence. Only one of them was actually going to protect our mother. I've spent most of my adult life being the daughter people describe as responsible, which sounds like a compliment until you realize it's usually said instead of a compliment. Responsible means nobody worries about you, which also means nobody really looks at you either. It means you're the one who shows up early to set up chairs and leaves late to fold them back down, while somebody else gets photographed cutting the cake. I used to think that was just my role in the family, the quiet one, the practical one, and for a long time I told myself I was fine with that. I wasn't as fine with it as I let on. Have you ever given someone everything you had, quietly, without asking for credit, and then watched them treat it like it wasn't enough, like it barely counted at all? Have you ever sat in a room full of people who love you on paper and felt completely invisible anyway? I'd love to know where you're listening from tonight, whether you're driving home from a shift or lying in bed with the lights off or just folding laundry and needing something to fill the quiet. Type your city below when you get a second. I read every single one, and it genuinely helps me know who's out there with me on nights like this. Before I keep going, if this kind of story means something to you, the kind where someone keeps their head down and does the right thing, even when nobody's clapping for it, do me a favor and hit subscribe. It costs nothing, it takes about 2 seconds, and it's honestly the only thing that tells me whether I should keep telling these stories or just keep them in my own journal where they've been living for years. I promise you, this one gets worse before it gets better, and then it gets so much better than I ever expected. Stay with me. My name is Emily Carter. I'm 29 years old, and I work as a notary and paralegal assistant at a small estate planning firm called Hendricks & Cole, just off Wilmington Pike in Dayton, Ohio. It's not a glamorous job. Most days I'm proofreading powers of attorney, scheduling signings, and making sure elderly clients understand what a revocable trust actually does before they sign their name to it. But it taught me things about money and paperwork and quiet danger that most people my age never think about until it's already too late for them. My mother, Diane Carter, raised my sister and me mostly on her own after my father, Robert, passed away when I was 17. He'd been sick for almost 2 years before that, and the medical bills didn't die with him. They just kept coming, addressed to a man who couldn't answer them anymore, which meant my mother had to. She worked as a school cafeteria supervisor for 26 years, retired early because of her knees, and now lives on a modest pension and Social Security in the same small house on Yorkhaven Drive where my sister and I grew up. She has never once, not one time in her life, asked either of us for anything. I've helped her quietly for years in ways she doesn't fully know about, and in ways she does but never mentions out loud because I think it embarrasses her a little. I covered her heating bill twice last winter when it spiked. I paid for a plumber when her water heater failed, and she tried to tell me she'd handle it herself with a space heater and a prayer. None of that ever came with an announcement. I never once stood in front of the family and said, "Look what I did for Mom." I just did it because that's what you do when you love someone and you have the means, even a little, and they don't. I live alone in a 1-bedroom apartment near downtown Dayton, the kind with a window unit air conditioner that rattles all summer, and a landlord who takes 3 weeks to fix anything. and I've made my peace with the fact that my life doesn't look impressive from the outside. I drive a used sedan with almost 90,000 miles on it. I meal prep on Sundays because eating out adds up fast on a paralegal's salary, and most months I put a small amount into a savings account before I let myself spend on anything extra. None of that ever made for exciting conversation at family dinners. But it meant that when I decided to quietly fix my mother's lean, I actually had the discipline and the financial habits in place to pull it off without falling apart myself. My sister's name is Brooke. She's 26, 3 years younger than me, and for as long as I can remember, she has been the version of a daughter that gets talked about at church, at hair salons, at the grocery store, when my mother runs into someone she hasn't seen since high school. Brooke is beautiful in a way that photographs well, she has a laugh that fills a room, and she works in event planning and social media marketing, which sounds impressive until you actually ask what it pays, which nobody in my family ever does. What people notice instead is what she wears, what she drives, and what she posts. Growing up, it was never a dramatic thing. Nobody sat me down and said, "Brooke matters more." It was smaller than that, and somehow that made it worse. It was the way my mother's face would light up differently when Brooke walked into a room versus when I did. It was the way relatives at Thanksgiving would ask Brooke about her exciting new job and ask me, almost as an afterthought, if I was still doing that paperwork thing. It was never one moment I could point to and say, "There, that's the problem." It was hundreds of tiny moments that added up over 20 years into something that lived permanently in my chest. Every single holiday followed the same quiet pattern. Christmas mornings, Brooke would show up with something wrapped in expensive paper, a scarf from a boutique downtown, perfume in a box with gold lettering, and my mother would gasp and hold it up for everyone to see. I'd usually give something practical, a good winter coat I found on sale, a set of the reading glasses my mother actually needed because she kept losing hers, and my mother would say, "Thank you, sweetheart," in a voice that was warm but quieter. The kind of thank you that doesn't get repeated to the aunts on the phone later that week. Practical love doesn't photograph as well as expensive love. I learned that early. Mother's Day was the same story, wearing a different outfit. Brooke once took our mother to a spa for a full day, hair, nails, a massage, lunch at a restaurant with cloth napkins, and posted about it online with a caption about how blessed she was to spoil her mom. I spent that same Mother's Day fixing the leak under my mother's kitchen sink because she'd mentioned it in passing 3 weeks earlier, and I knew she wasn't going to call a plumber and pay money she didn't have lying around. Nobody posted about that. Nobody needed to know about that. But it stung a little that nobody asked. What made it harder to swallow was that I genuinely believed for a long time that Brooke's gifts came from her own hard work, her own success, and that maybe I just wasn't as good at building a life as she was. I compared myself to a highlight reel and lost every single time, which is a trap I think a lot of people fall into with siblings, especially sisters. I didn't know yet what I would eventually learn through my job, through documents, through numbers that don't lie even when people do. I didn't know that some of what looked like success was actually borrowed quietly from the very people it was supposed to be impressing. Brooke's boyfriend at the time, and later her husband, was a guy named Tyler Mercer who worked in sales for a company that sold commercial office furniture. He drove a leased Mercedes he couldn't really afford, wore a watch that cost more than my monthly rent, and had this way of talking about money that made everyone assume there was a lot more of it than there actually was. Together, Brooke and Tyler built an image, vacation photos, a downtown apartment with exposed brick, dinners at restaurants where the menu doesn't list prices. My mother loved seeing her daughter live that life. I think some part of her believed it meant Brooke had made it in a way I hadn't. I still remember with a clarity that surprises me the 8th grade science fair, the year I spent 6 weeks building a working model of a water filtration system out of gravel, sand, and charcoal from an old grill, staying up late at the kitchen table, testing it over and over with a turkey baster and a mason jar until it actually worked. I won second place in the whole county. My mother came to see it, said she was proud, snapped one photo. That same week, Brooke, in 4th grade, sang a solo in the spring concert, off-key, forgetting half the words, and my mother cried happy tears in the audience and talked about it for a month. I didn't resent the tears. I just noticed even then which kind of effort got remembered in our house. My job never fared much better at family gatherings than my old science project had. I remember my Uncle Gary at a 4th of July barbecue years ago, asking what exactly I did all day, and when I explained notarizing documents and assisting with estate planning, he laughed and said, "So you're basically a professional paper stamper," and moved on to ask Brooke about her latest work trip before I could even finish my sentence. Nobody in my family understood that the paperwork I stamped was often the only thing standing between an elderly widow and losing her house to a nephew with bad intentions, or between a family and a decade of inheritance fights after somebody died without a will. It wasn't glamorous, it was just quietly, enormously important, the way most real protection tends to be. There was a cousin's wedding 2 years ago where the contrast played out almost too perfectly to be believable. Brooke gave the maid of honor toast, radiant in a dress she'd borrowed from a boutique in exchange for tagging them online, and had the entire reception hall in tears and laughter within 90 seconds. I had spent the 2 days before the wedding quietly helping our cousin's mother sort out a vendor contract dispute with the venue, using my job's contacts to get a refund on a deposit that had been wrongly withheld, saving the family almost $3,000 nobody in that reception hall ever heard about. Brooke got a standing ovation. I got a hug from my aunt in a hallway and a quiet "thank you nobody else witnessed." I want to be clear that I never hated my sister growing up. I loved her in the complicated way you love a sibling who gets treated like sunlight while you get treated like a fixture that just needs to keep working. I used to defend her when my aunts made comments about her spending. I used to tell myself she'd grow into being more grounded eventually. What I didn't realize was that the gap between us wasn't going to close on its own. It was going to widen quietly, gift by gift, holiday by holiday, until it finally cracked open in front of the entire family on a night that was supposed to be about our mother turning 60. There's a particular kind of tired that comes from being consistently underestimated by the people who are supposed to know you best. It's not loud. It doesn't announce itself. It just sits in your shoulders and your jaw for years. I used to come home from family dinners and sit in my car in the driveway for 10 extra minutes before going inside, just breathing, just letting my face relax out of the smile I'd been holding all evening. I never told anyone that. I never told my mother how much those small comments landed because I didn't want to make her choose sides, and honestly, some tiny part of me was scared she'd think I was just jealous. Maybe I was a little. That didn't make the ache less real. By the time my mother's 60th birthday started getting planned, I was already carrying a secret I hadn't told a single person in my family, not even my mother. It started almost by accident, 8 months earlier, when I was pulling background paperwork for a client at Hendricks & Cole, and I noticed something in a public records search that made my stomach drop. There was an old collections lien attached to my mother's property records, tied to unpaid medical debt from my father's final hospitalization. Debt that had technically transferred and re-aged under a different collection agency years after his death. Debt my mother apparently never fully understood was still legally attached to her house. I brought it to my boss carefully, framing it as a hypothetical question, and she confirmed what I was afraid of. If that lien sat unresolved long enough, and if my mother ever needed to sell the house, refinance it, or pass it down, it could become a real legal mess, potentially eating into whatever equity she had left in the one asset she owned outright. My mother had no idea. She'd been quietly making minimum payments on what she thought was just old medical debt, not realizing it had been formally attached to her property years earlier by a company that specialized in exactly this kind of thing. I didn't tell her right away. I sat with it for almost 2 weeks. Terrified, running numbers, trying to figure out what it would actually take to resolve it. The total, once I got a payoff letter through my firm's collections contact, came out to just under $14,000, an amount that felt both enormous and somehow achievable if I was disciplined enough. I decided, sitting alone at my kitchen table one Tuesday night, that I was going to fix this quietly, the way I fixed everything, without asking anyone for help and definitely without making it a family announcement. I didn't want credit. I wanted my mother safe. For 8 months, I picked up every extra notary appointment my firm would let me take, did freelance document prep for 2 other small offices on weekends, and stopped almost every non-essential spending in my own life. I cancelled a subscription box I liked. I skipped a friend's bachelorette weekend in Charleston and told her I had a work conflict, which technically wasn't a lie. I ate a lot of rice and beans that year, and I got very good at pretending that was a lifestyle choice and not a budget one. Every payment I made toward that lien felt like putting a brick back into the foundation of the one house that had ever felt like home to me. The one person who knew the truth was Angela Reyes, a loan officer at the credit union I bank with, who I'd become genuinely friendly with over the years through my job, since our paths crossed constantly on client business. I told her the whole situation one afternoon over coffee, half expecting her to tell me I was being dramatic or that it wasn't my responsibility to fix. Instead, she got quiet, then told me that in 15 years of banking, she'd seen exactly this pattern more times than she could count. One adult child quietly holding a family together, while another adult child got all the credit for love that photographed well. She didn't tell me what to do. She just told me I wasn't crazy for caring this much. By early spring, I'd paid the lien down to 0, and Hendricks & Cole helped me push through the final paperwork, a formal satisfaction of lien, notarized and recorded with the county, meaning my mother's house was, for the first time in years, completely free and clear in her name, with no hidden claims sitting quietly against it. My boss let me handle the notarization myself, which felt strangely poetic, me stamping and sealing the exact kind of document that protects people like my mother, using the exact skills everyone in my family treated like a boring desk job that wasn't worth bragging about at Thanksgiving. I decided I wasn't going to make a big announcement out of it. I thought about it honestly. I thought about standing up at her birthday party and explaining everything in detail, but that felt wrong, like it would turn something I did out of love into a performance, exactly the kind of performance I resented in the first place. So I settled on the envelope. Inside would be the recorded satisfaction of lien, a short letter I wrote explaining what it meant in plain language, and a small card that just said, "The house is yours now, completely, no strings attached anywhere." I sealed it the night before her party and put it in my purse, and I felt for the first time in 8 months something close to peace. Meanwhile, Brooke had been talking for weeks about a huge surprise she had planned for Mom's 60th, dropping hints at every family phone call, telling our aunts it was going to be, in her words, absolutely life-changing. She wouldn't give details, just kept saying it was going to blow everyone's mind, and I remember feeling that old familiar tightness in my chest, wondering what expensive photogenic thing she'd pulled together this time. Part of me was genuinely happy for our mother, who deserved something wonderful. Another part of me, the part I'm not proud of, braced myself for another quiet comparison I was going to lose. The party itself was held at a banquet room my aunt rented above a restaurant downtown, string lights, a rented sound system playing my mother's favorite songs from the 80s. 40-some guests, including cousins, old neighbors, women from her church choir. My mother looked genuinely radiant that night in a navy dress Brooke had picked out for her, and for the first hour I let myself just enjoy watching her laugh, watching her dance a little with my uncle, watching her blow out 60 candles on a cake shaped like a garden. I remember thinking, whatever happens tonight, at least she's having a good birthday. I didn't know yet how wrong that hope would turn out to be. I picked my mother up that afternoon before the party, since she doesn't love driving at night anymore, and I remember sitting in her driveway for a few extra minutes while she finished her makeup in the visor mirror, humming along to an old Anita Baker song on the radio, looking younger and lighter than I'd seen her look in months. She reached over at one point and squeezed my hand and said, "I don't know what I did to deserve 2 daughters who love me this much," and I remember thinking in that quiet, hopeful moment that maybe this year would finally feel different, that maybe the comparisons and the quiet competitions would take a back seat, just for one night, to simply celebrating her. I believed it honestly, right up until the moment I didn't anymore. The banquet room looked beautiful when we walked in, string lights crossing the ceiling in soft loops, a table near the entrance covered in photos of my mother through the decades, her wedding day holding baby Brooke, holding baby me, standing proudly in her cafeteria uniform at her retirement party. I stood in front of that photo table for a minute before the crowd thickened, looking at a picture of her at maybe 35, exhausted, still smiling, and felt this wave of protectiveness rise up in my chest, the same feeling that had pushed me to spend 8 months quietly clearing that lien in the first place. Whatever happened tonight, I told myself, at least I'd already done the one thing that actually mattered for her future. Around 9 o'clock, after dinner had settled and people were sipping coffee and decaf, my aunt announced it was time for gifts, and the room shifted its attention toward a small table near the cake where presents had been piling up all evening. Brooke practically jumped out of her chair, grabbing my mother by the hand and walking her toward the center of the room with this theatrical grin on her face, the kind she used to do in school plays. She'd clearly been waiting all night for this moment, and honestly, some part of the room seemed to be waiting for it too, because everybody already knew Brooke's gifts were an event, not just a gesture. Brooke unveiled a giant poster board propped against an easel, decorated with printed photos of a backyard patio, string lights, a hot tub, outdoor furniture. The whole thing labeled in glitter letters that said, "Mom's Dream Backyard." She announced, voice cracking with what looked like real emotion, that she had already put down a deposit on a full backyard renovation for our mother's house, complete with a hot tub installation, custom stone patio, and new outdoor furniture, telling the room it was already approved and scheduled to begin within the month. The room erupted, genuine gasps, applause, someone's phone flash going off, my aunt actually crying a little. My mother covered her mouth with both hands, tears in her eyes, and hugged Brooke so tightly I watched her navy dress wrinkle at the shoulder. People were already talking over each other, asking Brooke how she managed something so generous. And Brooke kept saying things like, "She deserves it, she's given us everything, it's the least I could do," phrases that sounded beautiful floating in a banquet room full of clapping relatives. I clapped too, genuinely, because whatever tension existed between my sister and me, I did want good things for my mother, and a renovated backyard where she could sit and relax sounded genuinely wonderful for her knees and her evenings alone. The applause hadn't even fully settled when my Aunt Carol turned toward me with the poster board still glowing under the string lights and said, loud enough for a good chunk of the room to hear, "Well, Emily, you've got a big act to follow." She said it warmly, laughing, not meaning any harm by it, but I felt every muscle in my back go tight anyway. My mother caught my eye across the room, gave me this small, apologetic smile like she already sensed the comparison hanging in the air, and hated it a little on my behalf. I forced my own smile back and reached for my purse, feeling the envelope through the fabric, suddenly aware of exactly how thin and light it was compared to a poster board covered in glitter letters. I want to explain what was going through my head in that moment because it matters. I wasn't ashamed of what I'd done. I knew, with total certainty, that the document sitting in that envelope was worth more to my mother's actual future than any hot tub could ever be. But knowing something intellectually and feeling steady about it in a room full of people who measure love in square footage and stone pavers are two very different experiences. I felt my heart rate climb the way it used to before I had to present a closing to a nervous client. That specific kind of nervous where you know you're right but you're not sure anyone else is going to see it that way. I thought briefly about not giving it to her in front of everyone, about pulling her aside quietly after the party, handing it to her in the kitchen, avoiding the audience entirely. Some part of me even started drifting toward the coat rack, ready to slip the envelope back into my purse for later. But then I looked at my mother standing there glowing from Brooke's announcement, and something in me refused to let this be one more thing I did in the shadows while my sister did her generosity in the spotlight. I had earned the right to stand in that room too. I decided I was going to give it to her the normal way, right there, like anyone else would. I want to take a second here, because I think some of you already know exactly the feeling I'm describing. That specific dread of being about to be compared to someone louder than you, in front of an audience that's already decided who the exciting daughter is. If any part of tonight's story feels familiar so far, if you've ever quietly done the harder, less flashy thing while somebody else got the parade, go ahead and subscribe now, because I promise you, what happens in the next few minutes of this story is worth staying for. This channel exists because people like you keep showing up for stories like mine, and it genuinely means something. My mother's memory flashed through my head uninvited, a memory from years earlier, back when my father first got sick, back when she used to sit at our kitchen table at midnight going through hospital bills with a highlighter, whispering numbers to herself like a prayer. I remembered being 14 years old, watching her hands shake as she wrote checks she wasn't sure would clear. I remembered thinking even then that I wanted to grow up and be the kind of person who could make that fear disappear for her, permanently. Standing in that banquet room 8 months of Saturday shifts later, I finally had, and nobody in that room knew it yet except me. I walked toward my mother slowly, the envelope in both hands, and the room's energy hadn't fully come down from Brooke's announcement, people still murmuring about hot tubs and patio stone, a few still snapping photos of the poster board propped against the easel. I felt like I was walking into a spotlight that had already dimmed before I even got there, but I kept going anyway, because this was never actually about competing with my sister. It was about my mother, about the $14,000 of quiet fear I'd erased from her life, about finally saying in my own way, "Look what I did for you too," even if nobody clapped the way they had for Brooke. I handed her the envelope and said simply, "Happy birthday, Mom, I love you." And I hoped she'd open it later, privately, when the room wasn't watching and expecting a show. But my mother, sweet and a little tipsy on the champagne toast from earlier, tore it open right there in front of everyone, the way you open any gift at a party, without thinking twice about it. I watched her pull out the folded document and the little card, watched her eyes scan the notary seal and the legal language, clearly not fully understanding at a glance what she was holding, just seeing paper, official-looking paper, in a plain envelope right after a poster board covered in glitter and a promised hot tub. My mother's face did something complicated, a small, confused smile, the kind people wear when they don't want to seem ungrateful but genuinely don't understand what they're looking at. She said, "Oh, honey, is this?" and trailed off, turning the document over like the answer might be printed on the back. Before I could explain it myself, before I could say the words, "This means the house is safe. Forever. No debt. No risk. Nothing hanging over you anymore." Brooke leaned over her shoulder, glanced at the paper for maybe 2 seconds and said, in a voice pitched perfectly for the whole room to hear, "Oh my gosh, Emily, is that a poor person's gift? Paperwork? Seriously?" The room laughed. Not everyone, but enough people, that specific ripple of laughter that spreads through a crowd before anyone individually decides whether it's actually funny, the kind of laughter that happens because someone confident said something with a smile and everyone else just follows the emotional cue. My uncle chuckled. A cousin I barely see snorted into her wine glass. My Aunt Carol, still glowing from the hot tub announcement, let out an awkward little laugh too, then seemed to catch herself and glance at me like she realized half a second too late that laughing might not have been the kind thing to do. Time does something strange in a moment like that. It stretches and compresses at once, and in the space of maybe 2 seconds I felt the entire evening replay behind my eyes. The 8 months of Saturday shifts, the canceled dental cleaning, the nights doing math at my kitchen table with a calculator I've had since community college, the $14,000, the notary seal I'd stamped myself. All of it reduced in one breath to 6 words from my own sister. Paperwork, seriously, delivered with a laugh she probably forgot about by the time she reached for her next glass of wine. I understood, standing there, that she genuinely had no idea what she'd just dismissed, and somehow that made it both easier and so much harder to carry. I stood there holding my empty hands where the envelope used to be, my face burning, that particular kind of burning that starts in your ears and spreads down your neck before you can stop it. I didn't say anything right away. I couldn't. My throat had done that thing it does when you're trying desperately not to cry in public, that tight swallowing feeling, and I remember thinking with strange clarity, "Do not cry, do not give her the satisfaction, not here, not in front of everyone, not over this." I looked at my mother instead, and her face had gone pale, embarrassed, caught between her 2 daughters in a way no mother should ever have, to be at her own birthday party. My mother tried to recover the moment, saying, No, this is very sweet, Emily. Thank you." But her voice had that forced brightness people use when they're trying to smooth something over in public that they know they'll actually think about later, alone, in the quiet. Brooke, for her part, didn't seem to register that she'd done anything wrong at all. She just moved on, laughing, already turning to accept another round of compliments about the backyard renovation, completely unaware, or maybe just unbothered, that she'd carved something out of me in front of 40 people using 6 casual words and a smile. I want to pause here and say something honestly. In that exact moment, I had every instinct in my body screaming at me to defend myself, to explain what was actually in that envelope, to say, "Do you understand what this cost me? Do you understand what this actually means for Mom's future versus your hot tub?" I could have. I had every fact on my side. But something in me, some old, tired, practiced instinct, told me that explaining myself in that room, right then, with everyone still riding the high of Brooke's big reveal, would only make me look defensive, petty, jealous of my little sister's generosity. So I said nothing. I just smiled that same cracked smile and let the moment pass. Nobody actually apologized to me in that room, not right away, and I think that's part of what made the moment sit so heavy in my chest. My Aunt Carol caught my eye once, gave me a small, guilty half-smile, the kind that says, "I know that wasn't okay," without actually saying anything out loud, and then went right back to admiring the poster board. My mother reached for my arm, briefly gave it a small squeeze, but the room had already moved on, already reorganized itself around the next exciting thing, and I understood, standing there, that if I wanted anyone to fully register what had just happened, I was going to have to be the one to make them see it, someday, somehow, on my own terms. I excused myself a few minutes later, telling my mother I needed some air, and walked out through the back hallway of the banquet room toward a small outdoor patio area near the kitchen entrance, where the catering staff kept their supply carts and nobody else seemed to be. I stood out there in the cool evening air, arms wrapped around myself despite the warm night, and let exactly 4 tears fall before I wiped them away with the back of my hand and took a long, slow breath. I didn't sob. I didn't spiral. I just stood there in the dark for a few minutes, feeling the specific, familiar ache of being unseen by the people whose seeing mattered most to me. It was there, on that patio, that I made a decision that I now think of as the actual turning point of this whole story, more than anything that happened later with banks or documents or family dinners. I decided, standing alone in the dark, with mascara probably smudged under my eyes, that I was done explaining myself to people who had already decided what kind of daughter I was. I wasn't going to announce what I'd done for my mother. I wasn't going to correct Brooke in front of the family, or demand anyone apologize. I was simply going to stop performing my worth out loud, and let the actual facts of my life speak for themselves, whenever they were ready to. A few minutes later, my phone buzzed in my purse. A text from Angela Reyes, who I'd told earlier that week I was nervous about giving the gift at the party in front of everyone. She'd written, simply, "How did it go tonight?" And I stood there on that patio typing out the whole ugly moment, the poor person's gift comment, the laughter, my mother's pale face. Angela called me almost immediately instead of texting back, and the first thing she said, before anything else, was, "Emily, listen to me. People like your sister live off the reaction in the room. People like you live off whether the thing you did actually holds up 6 months from now. Give it time. It always shows itself eventually, if you've ever needed someone to tell you exactly that the quiet right thing you did will eventually hold up. Even when the loud thing gets all the applause tonight, consider this your sign. And consider hitting subscribe while you're at it, because I have a feeling a lot of you needed to hear that as much as I did standing on that patio. This channel is free, it always will be, and every single subscriber is genuinely the reason I keep sitting down to record these instead of just letting them stay in my own head. Alright, let me tell you what happened 3 weeks later, because this is the part where everything started to turn. For the first couple of weeks after the party, life went back to its normal rhythm, the way it always does, no matter how big a wound feels in the moment. I went to work, I processed my paperwork, I called my mother on Sundays, like always, and neither of us mentioned the envelope again. She thanked me once more, quietly, over the phone, a few days after the party, in a small, almost embarrassed voice, saying she understood what the document meant once she'd had time to read it properly, and that it meant more to her than she'd been able to say in the moment. I told her it was okay, that I hadn't expected a big reaction, which wasn't entirely true, but it felt like the right thing to say. In those first couple of weeks, I noticed something shifting quietly inside me, something I hadn't expected. I wasn't waiting for an apology anymore, and I wasn't rehearsing the speech I could have given at the party either, the one where I listed every fact and made everyone finally understand. I started, almost without deciding to, treating my own effort as enough on its own, whether or not anyone clapped for it. I told a coworker at Hendricks and Cole a stripped-down version of what happened, half expecting sympathy, and instead she just nodded slowly and said, "That's the whole job description of being the responsible one, isn't it? Nobody claps until something goes wrong and you're the one who fixes it quietly, again." I laughed, but it landed somewhere true. Brooke, meanwhile, was riding high on the backyard renovation announcement, posting updates online about the upcoming project, tagging the contractor's company, captioning photos of mood boards with words like transformation and blessed. My mother mentioned during one of our Sunday calls that a crew had come out to measure the yard and give a final quote, and that Brooke had assured her everything was already handled, paid for, nothing for Mom to worry about. I remember feeling a small flicker of unease when she said that, a professional instinct from years of reading paperwork, but I told myself it wasn't my business and let it go. The unease came back with real force about 3.5 weeks after the party, on a Tuesday evening when my mother called me sounding confused and a little shaken. She said an envelope had arrived at the house from a company called Green Path Home Improvements Financing, addressed to her, Diane Carter, referencing an account number she didn't recognize with a balance due of over $22,000 and a note about a missed first payment. She said she assumed it was a mistake, some kind of scam mail, since Brooke had told her everything was already paid for, but something about the letter had her hands shaking a little as she read it to me over the phone. I told her not to throw it away, to keep it safe, and that I'd look into it the next morning using contacts I had through work. I didn't sleep much that night. Something about the shape of it, a financing company, an account in my mother's name, a large balance, felt uncomfortably familiar from cases I'd seen at Hendricks and Cole, situations where an adult child convinced an aging or trusting parent to co-sign or fully apply for financing they didn't fully understand, sometimes with good intentions, sometimes not, but always leaving the parent legally exposed if anything went wrong with the payments. The next day I called GreenPath directly, using my professional credentials to request account verification on my mother's behalf. With her permission given over speakerphone, what I learned made my stomach drop in a completely different way than it had at the party. The application for the backyard renovation financing had been submitted in my mother's name, using my mother's social security number, with my mother listed as the sole primary borrower, not Brooke, not Tyler, my mother alone, responsible for the full $26,000 loan, of which only a small first payment had ever been made before it went delinquent. I called Brooke immediately, trying to stay calm, and she got defensive almost instantly, saying it was just a formality, that the financing company gave a better interest rate if it went through Mom's information, since Mom owned her home outright, that she'd been planning to make every single payment herself the whole time, that it wasn't a big deal. When I asked why my mother's name was the only one on the application, why there was no co-signer listed, why the missed payment notice had gone straight to my mother instead of to her, Brooke went quiet for a moment, then said in a smaller voice than I'd heard from her in years, I didn't think it would matter. I was going to handle it. I didn't feel triumphant when I found that out, whatever you might expect. I sat in my car in the parking garage at work for a long time after that call with GreenPath, hands still on the steering wheel, feeling something closer to grief than vindication. Some part of me wanted so badly to be wrong, to find out it was a clerical error, that my sister hadn't actually put our 60-year-old mother's only asset on the line to fund a hot tub and a poster board reveal. But the account records were clear, dated, time-stamped, undeniable in the specific, boring, factual way that only paperwork can be, the exact kind of paperwork Brooke had laughed off as a poor person's gift 6 weeks earlier. It turned out, once Angela helped me dig through public lending disclosures with me over a rushed lunch break, that Brooke's own credit had been maxed out for over a year, largely from the leased Mercedes. a designer watch she'd bought Tyler for his birthday, and a string of smaller loans neither of them had kept current, meaning no legitimate lender would have approved $26,000 in her name alone. My mother's home, paid off and untouched by debt for the first time in years because of what I'd quietly done 8 months earlier, had looked, to a financing company and apparently to my own sister, like a convenient, trustworthy asset to borrow against. I hung up the phone that afternoon and sat alone in my apartment for a long time, turning over the strange, uncomfortable fact that I still didn't want to destroy my sister, even now, even with real proof in hand, that she'd risked our mother's home for a poster board moment. I just wanted the truth to exist somewhere solid, on paper, the way I'd always trusted paper to hold things that people couldn't be trusted to hold themselves. I called Angela that night, not for banking advice this time, just to talk, and she reminded me gently that fixing this the right way, calmly, through proper channels, would matter more in a year than any satisfying blow-up ever could. I believed her, mostly, though some small, tired part of me still wanted just once to be loud. The contractor, it turned out, had already poured the concrete base for the patio and delivered materials for the hot tub installation before the missed payment triggered an automatic hold on the project, meaning there was now an unfinished, half-built mess in my mother's backyard. A company owed money and a formal notice that if the account stayed delinquent much longer, Greenpath had language in their contract allowing them to file a mechanic's lien against the property itself to recover their costs. The very thing I had spent 8 months and $14,000 quietly clearing off my mother's house, a debt lien threatening her home, was about to happen again. This time, because of the gift everyone had applauded. I sat with my mother at her kitchen table that Thursday evening, the same table where she used to highlight hospital bills when I was 14, and walked her through every document, every account statement, every piece of paper Greenpath had sent, explaining it slowly and gently the way I'd explain it to any client at my firm. I watched her face move through confusion, then disbelief, then something quieter and heavier, a kind of grief I hadn't seen on her since my father passed. She looked up at me at one point and said, "So the poor person's gift was the one protecting me this whole time, and the fancy one was the one putting me at risk." I didn't say anything. I just nodded and reached for her hand. The whole thing became impossible to keep quiet a few weeks later, at a smaller 4th of July cookout at my mother's house. The same backyard, now sitting half-finished, a concrete slab with rebar poking out of one edge, a stack of tarp-covered patio stones nobody had touched in a month. My Aunt Carol, walking through the yard with a plate of potato salad, asked Brooke cheerfully how the renovation was coming along, and Brooke, visibly caught off guard with half the family standing right there, gave a stiff, vague answer about permit delays that anyone paying attention could tell wasn't true. My mother, standing near the grill, went quiet in a way that made several people glance over. It was Uncle Steve, of all people, who pushed it further, not maliciously, just genuinely curious, asking if the hot tub company had refunded the deposit since nothing had moved in weeks. Brooke's face went pale, and in the silence that followed, my mother, gently but clearly, said that actually there had been some trouble with how the project was financed, that the account had ended up in her name instead of Brooke's, and that it had gone delinquent. You could hear the shift in the yard immediately, forks pausing halfway to plates, conversations dying mid-sentence, everyone slowly putting together what that actually meant. Brooke tried to recover the way she always did, laughing it off, saying it was just a paperwork mix-up, that she was handling it, that people were making a bigger deal out of it than necessary, but this time the room wasn't laughing along with her the way it had at the birthday party. This time my mother was the one standing there having to explain why there was a construction lien threat sitting on her house, why a debt collector had called her personal cell phone twice that week, why the daughter everyone praised for being so generous had put her own mother's home at risk to fund a surprise nobody had asked her to finance in the first place. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't launch into a speech about the notarized lien release sitting safely on file with the county, the 8 months of Saturday shifts, the rice and beans, the cancelled dental appointment. I simply said, calmly, that I'd already been in touch with Greenpath and with a lending compliance contact through my office, that we were formally disputing the account on the grounds that my mother hadn't fully understood or consented to being the sole borrower. and that either the project would need to be finished and repaid properly by whoever authorized it, or the account would need to be unwound entirely. My mother looked at me across the yard, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like she was actually seeing me. Tyler pulled me aside near the driveway that same afternoon, looking genuinely uncomfortable in a way I'd never seen from him before, and admitted quietly that he'd known about the financing arrangement the whole time, that he and Brooke had talked about it and decided it was the only way to get the project done without waiting to save up themselves. He said he was sorry, that he'd told Brooke it felt risky, but that she'd insisted her mom wouldn't mind, that it was temporary, that they'd have it paid off before anyone even noticed. I didn't yell at him either. I just told him that good intentions don't change what a signature on a loan document legally means, and that I hoped he understood that now. He nodded, and for once he didn't have a confident answer ready. Over the following month, working alongside Angela and one of the compliance attorneys at my firm, we got GreenPath to freeze collection activity while the dispute was reviewed, ultimately getting the account restructured so that Brooke, not my mother, became legally responsible for the remaining balance, backed by a payment agreement. She had no way of talking her way out of this time, since it was in writing, signed, and witnessed. The contractor, once payment resumed properly, came back and finished the patio, minus the hot tub, which got quietly removed from the contract altogether. My mother ended up with a modest, paid-for patio, nothing glamorous, but hers, free and clear, the same way her house now was. At Thanksgiving that year, something small but noticeable had changed in how the family treated me. My Aunt Carol asked me, genuinely in front of everyone, what I thought about a trust question she'd been wondering about for her own house, and actually listened to the answer instead of glancing past me toward Brooke's end of the table. My mother, without any prompting from me, mentioned twice during dinner how grateful she was for the work I do, calling it real protection, her words, not mine. Brooke was quieter than usual that day, not sulking exactly, more like she was recalibrating something about how she saw the family and me for the first time in a long while. A few weeks after that, my mother asked me to help her formally update her will and set up a proper power of attorney, naming me, not out of favoritism, she was careful to say, but because she trusted my judgment with exactly this kind of thing, and because she never wanted either of her daughters to be blindsided by paperwork again, the way she nearly had been. We sat at Hendricks & Cole together on a quiet Tuesday afternoon, my boss walking her through every clause slowly and patiently, and I remember watching my mother sign her name with a steady hand, finally, fully in control of what happened to everything she'd built. It felt like a strange, quiet kind of full circle. My mother never gave a big speech about it. That's not who she is, but a few weeks after everything settled, she showed up at my apartment on a random Wednesday evening with a container of her honey cornbread, the kind she used to make every year for my birthday when I was little, and sat with me at my tiny kitchen table for 2 hours just talking, really talking, the way we hadn't in years. She told me she was ashamed it took a crisis for her to fully see what I'd been quietly doing for her all along, and that she was sorrier than she could say for laughing, even a little, at the party. I told her she didn't need to apologize anymore. I just needed her to know I saw myself clearly now, whether the room clapped for me or not. Angela told me once, months after everything had settled, that she thinks the reason this whole story stuck with her so much was that it wasn't really about money at all, not underneath everything. It was about which kind of love a family decides to reward out loud. Some love announces itself with balloons and glitter letters and gets celebrated in the moment. Other love shows up quietly, for years, with no audience, and only gets recognized when a crisis finally forces everyone to look closely enough to see it. I think about that a lot now, how close I came to spending my whole life assuming the second kind of love simply mattered less, just because it made less noise. I never did give Brooke the blow-up conversation some part of the old me might have wanted, the one where I list every slight, every comparison. Every holiday I quietly swallowed my pride at. Instead, I sat her down once calmly at a coffee shop instead of a family gathering and told her plainly that I loved her, that I didn't want to fight, but that I was done being the punchline in her stories and done being an invisible line item in her generosity. I told her that from now on, if she wanted to use our mother's name, our mother's credit, or our mother's home for anything, she'd be going through me first, professionally on paper, whether she liked it or not. She didn't argue. I think some part of her already knew she'd earned that boundary. Things between us are still finding a new normal, and I won't pretend it's a perfect Hollywood ending with matching sweaters at Christmas and inside jokes rebuilt overnight. Brooke still tends toward the flashy gesture, the loud announcement, and honestly, that's just who she is, and I've made peace with not needing her to change into someone else to feel like my worth is settled. What changed is me. I stopped auditioning for a role in my own family. I stopped translating quiet love into something louder just to be believed. I show up, I do what's right, and I no longer need the room to clap for it to know it mattered. Sometimes I drive past my mother's house now, just to check on the patio, the plain grey stone one, no hot tub, no glitter poster board ever attached to it, and I feel something settle in my chest that I don't think I ever felt during all those years of trying to be seen the loud way. It's not pride exactly, and it's not relief either. It's closer to a quiet, steady certainty that I know exactly who I am in that family now, regardless of who gets the bigger reaction at the next birthday party. My mother sits out there most evenings after dinner, telling me on the phone how the stone stays cool even in summer, how she waters the little herb garden she planted along the edge. Small, ordinary, real things that nobody needs to applaud for them to matter. I didn't need to prove my worth by shouting. The numbers did that for me, eventually, the way the truth usually does if you're patient enough to let it. If you've made it this far with me tonight, if any piece of this reminded you of your own family, your own quiet efforts nobody applauded, I hope you'll hit subscribe before you go. Share this with someone who's been the responsible one in their family for way too long without anyone noticing, and know that I see you, even if your own room hasn't quite caught up yet. Thank you for listening tonight. I'll see you in the next one.